vavizinyo vamulavi mamano ndivonlene satwa mama amunzi khomlene satwa mna atsukili tono gigolive omale shkuru leshishingan maradu utamkumata sapate napi matifambo nkamadu andirwa mafasani mino ikutiranga zvilavi mama searanza akutanga mwino anga bosha nilifu mama vavizinyo vamulavi mama no
Tsepiso Makwetla winds it down on Africa World Hour, 9 to 10 p.m.
And it is exactly 2100 hours on this Tuesday evening. A very good evening to you. Warm welcome. This is Africa World Hour with you for the next 60 minutes as we bring you the very latest developments from the heart of Africa to all corners of the globe. And the particular corner that we're concentrating on at the moment is in New York at the UN headquarters, where South Africa's president is joining other world leaders in addressing the UN General Assembly in a debate. And the debate is titled around the 80th anniversary of the UN. And of course, we've seen leaders like President Donald Trump unpacking that, in fact, pointing a finger at the UN, saying it's failed its mandate. So we'll take you live there as and when we're able to find out who is speaking, and particularly looking at African leaders. So let's start with your news headlines.
1 hour, one continent, one voice. Africa World Hour with Tsepiso Makwetla on Channel Africa, the African perspective.
So the two-state solution was one of the top stories at the UN. So what we saw today is that there is still no let-up in Israel's offensive in Gaza City as more countries formally recognize a Palestinian state. At the UN General Assembly in New York, Israeli military vehicles have taken up new positions in the city center, while artillery shelling and quadcopter drone attacks continue to drive people from their homes. The BBC's Yolanda Nell reports.
What local journalists are saying is that since dawn there has been a heavy Israeli bombardment. That's in terms of airstrikes and also artillery shelling. They say that there is smoke billowing in the sky and the constant sound of drones overhead. Israeli armoured vehicles are said to have pushed into new positions in the heart of Gaza City, close to the main UNRWA headquarters, close to the Islamic University there as well, around the Jordanian Field Hospital, which is to the south. That field hospital is now being closed and relocated to the south.
Provisional official results in the West African state of Guinea point to a 90% yes vote in a referendum on a new constitution. It is the result, if the result rather is confirmed, Guinea's military ruler, General Mamadi Doumbouya, will then be able to run for president. The opposition boycotted the referendum, saying the results are already determined. The BBC's Ijeoma Ndukwe reports.
Provisional results were announced on Monday evening in a referendum that marks a pivotal moment in the country's transition from military to civilian rule. However, critics have denounced it as a power grab by junta leader Mamadi Doumbouya, who seized power in a coup 4 years ago. Mr. Doumbouya has not officially announced his intention to run in upcoming presidential elections, but the new constitution paves the way for his candidacy. Guinea is among 4 West African nations, Mali, Niger and Burkina Faso, currently under military rule.
And the provisional results in West African state of Guinea, that's what we were looking at now. We move on to the former U.S. Vice President Kamala Harris. She believes that the guardrails have come off U.S. democracy and has called on Americans to resist. She was speaking to MSNBC in her first interview since losing to Donald Trump in the U.S. presidential election. Harris has likened Trump to a communist dictator who was using the federal government at his whim and fancy. She says she's alarmed by the overhaul of the judiciary.
These titans of industry are not speaking up. Perhaps it is because his threats to take out vengeance on his critics is something that they fear, and I get that. But at some point, they've got to stand up for the sake of the people who rely on all of these institutions to have integrity and to, at some point, be the guardrails against a tyrant.
Meanwhile, U.S. President Donald Trump has accused the United Nations of leading and financing immigration, which he describes as an assault on Western countries. Trump was speaking at the UN General Assembly in New York. He dismissed the UN as an organization that has lost its purpose, saying it hasn't helped him stop the wars he claims he has ended.
No president or prime minister, and for that matter, no other country has ever done anything close to that. And I did it in just 7 months. It's never happened before. There's never been anything like that. I'm very honored to have done it. It's too bad that I had to do these things instead of the United Nations doing them. And sadly, in all cases, the United Nations did not even try to help in any of them.
And of course, the debate on the UN General Secretary's report is continuing. He is introducing the annual report on activities of the organization at the opening of the general debate. So that happened earlier on. African leaders and world leaders on that stage. They have 15 minutes each to have their say, and we are watching to see when President Cyril Ramaphosa, we understand that he's expected to take to the stage any time now. Now, South Africa's National Police Commissioner General Fani Masemola has told the Madlanga Commission how Police Minister Senzo Mchunu was visibly angry that police had arrested a suspect that was linked to the killing of a councillor. Masemola is currently giving his testimony at the Madlanga Commission. He says Mchunu's reaction was quite strange after the KwaZulu-Natal Political Killings Task Team made a breakthrough in the case.
Okay, no, it's quite strange it was first in my career to see a minister angry that police have done a good job, because here police have arrested somebody that is linked to the killing of a councillor, and he was angry and that they took over this docket.
And finally, we talk about world leaders, as we mentioned, gathering in New York for the United Nations General Assembly G20 foreign ministers. They've also met on the sidelines to prepare the ground for the leaders' summit in November. South Africa's International Relations Minister Ronald Lamola, who is in the US at the moment attending the UN General Assembly, says the meeting is crucial for building consensus on key global challenges. Botlhale Bophele has more.
G20 foreign ministers have gathered on the sidelines of the United Nations General Assembly in New York as the clock ticks towards the G20 Leaders Summit in South Africa in November. President Cyril Ramaphosa is expected to address the meeting, and International Relations Minister Ronald Lamola has echoed that South Africa's agenda is packed with pressing global issues.
It is a meeting of the G20 Foreign Affairs Ministers meetings on the sideline of the UN General Assembly. In terms of the agenda, the meeting will be broadly encompassing on all those issues that need us to implement as resolutions or decisions of the UN, including the financing for development, the Compromiso di Seville Declaration.
Among the key issues are multilateral reform, global peace and security, climate finance, and food security. The question of the US's participation has also been closely watched.
Is that the US will participate. There is confirmation, but it's not yet very clear at which level. But they will definitely participate because they have now decided to re-engage with the whole process of the G20, and they are participating in the various meetings of the G20 hosted by South Africa.
While attendance has been confirmed, the level of engagement by Washington is still to be clarified. South Africa says the G20's work remains closely linked to the UN General Assembly's leaders' debate.
This is to reinforce the message that the UN is the prime multilateral platform of the world for all member states. Indeed, we are reinforcing the work of the United Nations, and it is for that reason that this meeting has been brought on the margins of the UN General Assembly, which also give an opportunity to member states of the UN who are not necessarily member states of the G20.
With deep divisions within the group, Lamola says significant groundwork has been done to push for a consensus and resolution at the upcoming Leaders Summit.
Yes, it's the nature of any multilateral fora that negotiations on the text or declarations will go on until the last minute. This one of South Africa is no exception. We have been hard at work with all the meetings, working group meetings, the foreign ministers meetings, the Sherpa track, and all the engagements have been pointing towards a discussion, and the negotiations will continue. This meeting will further enhance that work.
And on the issue of Palestine, now recognized as a state by countries such as Australia, Lamola reiterated South Africa's support for a two-state solution and called for broader consensus across multilateral platforms.
This is a development, and we see it as a major turning point to deal with the Israeli impunity that is currently unfolding in the Gaza Strip, including the UN Human Rights Commission's report, which has provided with forensic detail the fact that what is currently unfolding in Palestine and the Gaza Strip is genocide. So we welcome this. It's a turning point. We call all members of the United Nations to follow suit and continue with the pressure to ensure that there is a cessation of fire.
The Foreign Ministers meeting in New York sets the stage for the G20 Leaders Summit in November, where South Africa says diplomacy and dialogue will be key to shaping a united global response to shared challenges. Bukhali Pele, SABC News.
At 12 minutes past 9, still monitoring what is happening there in New York on the UN General Assembly stage. But as we do that, we just reflect on what is going to happen over the next couple of days. The debate, UN General Assembly debate, the theme being on 80 years of existence of the UN, will of course continue up until the weekend, and we look at what is expected of President Cyril Ramaphosa as he addresses the UN General Assembly. We saw we saw US President Donald Trump address them, lashing out at the UN, saying that they've lost sense of their purpose and that they have not even helped him end the wars that he has, and he spoke about the end of the war with Iran, and of course he is also looking at his interventions in the GRC and between Israel and Palestine at the moment. But on these one-on-one engagements, let's speak about also what the president is going to look at tomorrow. He's going to give opening remarks at the Trade and Investment Executive Dialogue. The event is hosted in collaboration with the U.S. Chamber of Commerce. We're joined now by international relations analyst Dr. Charles Sinkala to just speak to us through the issues that are going to arise. Dr. Sinkala, very good evening to you, and thank you so much for speaking to us. President Cyril Ramaphosa addresses the UN General Assembly. In what atmosphere would you say? On the one hand, we have seen the UN human rights organ shore up South Africa's case by saying genocide is indeed occurring in Israel, but that too has led to a rather tense relationship with the United States that has seen the US ladle on more sanctions on South Africa as a result.
Yes, it is saddening that to hear that, nations such as United States of America still continues with the support of Israel, which has committed genocide in Palestine, while the world recognizes Palestine as a state. I think United Nations and other parties which are, conveyed at the United Nations Security Council is to recognize and respect the sovereignty of other nations. Article 213 and other articles which have been enshrined in the United Nations Charter prescribed a mandate of bilateral respect, to sovereign countries and recognition. That has to be abide to it. You cannot have a unilateral, decision by states such as the United States of America, to continue, to support Israel at the hymn that they continue to violate international laws, violate international agreements of recognitions of states such as Palestine. I think, in the world that we live in, we have to respect jurisprudence in terms of territorial integrity and sovereignty of nations such as Palestine, in terms of addressing these issues. When one considers the aspects of only one nation without putting into consideration of other nations' interest, without recognizing the objective of nations, becomes a challenge.
Dr. Zinkala, let me then ask you this question. As you say, there should be unity over such issues that are life and death, and it could actually see a generation wiped out. But the reality is that the UN General Assembly, as it sits there, is not united. We've seen US President Donald Trump address European nations saying they'll go to hell on the starts that they've taken on Palestine recently. But we've also seen countries, even on African soil, take a protectionist, nationalist viewpoint on their relations with the US because of fear of not wanting to miss out on benefits of being a good trading partner or having good bilateral relations with the US. Ultimately, this debate, the 80th anniversary of the UN, is a very important one. But how do you foresee it ending? With greater resolve to stand by preventing human rights violations, or is there going to be even greater chasms seen?
Yeah, it is indeed saddening when nations, become subservient to other nations while they are on the level field in terms of recognition, simply because United Nations is specifically dependent on the United States funding for the operative of the United Nations Security Council. Things such as what has happened in the wars across the world, where unilaterally nations decide which side they should support. And it becomes a challenge when I know and understand fully that allies should support nations that they believe that their international policy aligns with their national policies. But objectively looking at the issues that are surrounding the nations that are unilaterally having a beef with other nations which are purporting genocide in such a nation such as Palestine. I think geopolitics must coin to a position where they can recognize and look at issues objectively rather than subjectively.
Okay, so we're going to see President Cyril Ramaphosa give the opening address at the Trade and Investment Executive Dialogue tomorrow, an event that's going to be hosted in collaboration with the U.S. Chamber of Commerce. Given, as we mentioned, the tense relations with the United States government, how strategically important is the U.S. Chamber of Commerce in terms of racketing up more investments? Does it have greater sway or as much sway as, say, multilateral, bilateral relations with the U.S. government? Can South Africa count on investment from, based on their relations with the U.S. Chamber of Commerce?
Well, they can base on the relations with the United States. South Africa stands as a position where United States of America is much needed in terms of trade and investment and other treaties that they have signed over the time. But these treaties and the trade and investment must be bilaterally, in agreement in terms of policies for the both countries, to recognize their benefits, on the win-win situation. It cannot be a one-way road. And President Cyril Ramaphosa, has been, putting this strategically in the position that let's be on the dinner table. I can also recall my friend Professor Lumumba, from Kenya, who has also said Africa must be on the dinner table, not to be like food to be eaten or a spoon or waiters, but we must be full participants, in the negotiations and in the setting up of tariffs between the two countries. I see that 56% of what South Africa exports to the United States of America has been, tariffs that has been exposed. But while United States of America demands in excess of 77% that they must have free tariffs, in terms of dealing with the country, United States of America, we cannot achieve such an imbalance in terms of trade.
Now, on the one hand, U.S. President Donald Trump is saying to Americans regarding the economy that the tough stances that he's taken, particularly on tariffs, is that it will result in a bit of an ache for the U.S., but that it won't be for a very long time, that it's in the short term for a better economy in the long run. South Africa, which is feeling the pinch of that policy, also has to give a little if it's asking for foreign direct investment, if it's trying to increase jobs, deal with the energy insecurity and the infrastructure deficits. It obviously also has to make some concessions. What can it make in the face of misinformation that has driven the Trump tariff policies towards it?
Well, Trump policies has been based on political ideologies and political mileage. And I think nations must go beyond tariffs that are motivated by political and geopolitics. We must understand that the world now has to be based on policies that also puts into consideration in terms of sovereignty of other nations' interest. Unilaterally interests of policies where they're dominated becomes a challenge. But United States of America, nevertheless, on the other side, has over the years deposited a narrative of dependence, where we have seen what has happened over the years, that United Nations has procured interest in terms of spearheading such as CDS or CDF's narratives in terms of supporting nations, either through CDF or PEPFAR or USAID and other funding mechanisms that has been supporting governments, especially in South Africa, where they've been funding quite a larger chunk in terms of either health infrastructure or any other platform. helping nations such as South Africa in terms of health and infrastructure cannot equalize to a nation to heed or to be subservient to nations such as the United States of America to hear or redirect any other narratives that the policies the United States of America has presented without recognizing what is the interest of South Africa. What would be the interest of South Africa in terms of the foreign policy, in terms of recognizing nations that are in dire stress,
all right,
in terms of conflict. And I think South Africa has put up a international policy where they have recognized Palestine as a state.
Dr. Sankala, allow me to just pause you there for a minute, because President Cyril Ramaphosa has in fact ascended to the stage at the UN General Assembly 80th debate. Let's hear what he has to say on some of these issues.
Humanity from the scourge of war and to build a peaceful, prosperous and just world arising from the devastation brought about by global conflict. Through the UN Charter, the nations of the world pledge to uphold peace, development and human rights, which would be underpinned by international law. Now more than ever, we are called upon to uphold the values and advance the purpose of the United Nations. We are also called upon to advance cooperation and solidarity between nations. We are called upon to promote multilateralism and safeguard the institutions that enable it. South Africa's engagement in the international sphere echoes our domestic imperatives of eradicating poverty, reducing unemployment, and addressing the root causes of inequality. Our foreign policy is guided not only by the needs of our people, but also those of the continent of Africa and the global South. Inspired by our own history, South Africa strives to maintain world peace and also the settlement of all international disputes through negotiation and dialogue and not through war. We therefore welcome the strong partnership between the African Union and the United Nations in promoting peace, security and stability on the African continent. This year, South Africa is honored to preside over the G20. This is the first time that G20 Leaders Summit will be held on the African continent, the cradle of humanity. South Africa's G20 presidency is guided by the theme equality, solidarity and sustainability. To give full meaning to our theme of equality, solidarity and sustainability, we have invited the G20 countries to join us in prioritizing the following areas. Firstly, in discussion to strengthen disaster resilience and response by addressing the increasing frequency and impact of climate-induced natural disasters. Secondly, to ensure that we have debt sustainability for low-income countries by crafting innovative ways to support countries to have low levels of debt to maintain economic stability. Thirdly, to discuss how to mobilize finance for a just energy transition by encouraging investments in renewable energy and sustainable technologies, without foregoing what we would call base load energy sources. Fourthly, by harnessing critical minerals for inclusive growth and sustainable development through the value addition processes, that is, beneficiation of these minerals at the source where the minerals are extracted, to foster the development of communities where these minerals are found. These priorities reflect South Africa's commitment to addressing global challenges and promoting inclusive growth and sustainable development. Our country's G20 presidency is a significant opportunity for South Africa to advocate for Africa's development agenda and to amplify African voices in global economic governance for a continent that is irreversibly on the rise. As member states of the United Nations, we have all adopted the Sustainable Development Goals. However, many of these goals remain elusive. There are many reasons that hold many countries back from fulfilling and implementing these development goals. Some of these reasons are lack of sufficient financial resources that can finance the advance that these countries need to make to fulfill those goals. Many countries with developing economies, especially in Africa and the Global South, do not have adequate capital to finance their development goals. They are indebted and are paying much more on debt servicing than they do on health and education. In fact, these countries pay much more than countries in the North for their debt. Yet through global solidarity, by having fairer lending rules, especially for several of the Global South countries, we can achieve our shared commitment.
That there is President Cyril Ramaphosa speaking there at the UN General Assembly debate. Let's see if we can get him back. But basically, he's just been pretty much laying the land for what South Africa sees as the forefront issue, speaking about global solidarity, particularly in ensuring fairer lending rules for the Global South.
Is capable of managing differences and coordinating positions in global trade. Trade is one of the most important instruments to mobilize domestic resources for development. It is concerning that geopolitical shocks and unprecedented trade policy volatility are destabilizing the global economy and jeopardizing a critical source of development finance. In fact, trade is now being used as a weapon against a number of countries in the world. We must redouble our efforts to strengthen the link between trade and development. Unilateral trade practices and economic cohesion have a detrimental impact on many nations. This includes the economic embargo against Cuba, which has caused untold damage to the country's economy over the years. This unfair embargo must be lifted, and we want it lifted sooner rather than later. In the midst of global trade uncertainty, the African continent is providing a pragmatic example of constructive collaboration and cooperation by using the African Continental Free Trade Area as an engine for sustainable growth and development. This will, with commitment, become the central pillar of economic cooperation and integration for our continent. As part of the effort to build more inclusive economies, South Africa's G20 presidency has launched an extraordinary committee of independent experts on global wealth inequality. This committee, chaired by Professor Joseph Stiglitz, a Nobel laureate, will deliver the first ever report on global inequality to G20 leaders when they meet in November in Johannesburg in South Africa. Climate change is an existential threat. We are failing future generations by our inability to reduce global warming. Climate change is reversing economic growth and development gains in many countries, especially in the global south. Although Africa carries the least responsibility for climate change, many countries on the continent of Africa experience much of its harshest effects. Extreme weather events like floods and droughts are driving food insecurity, displacing populations, causing damage to infrastructure, and leading to the unnecessary loss of livelihoods. Member states must honor their undertakings and commitments in line with the guiding principle of common but differentiated responsibilities and respective capabilities. The Secretary General recently reported that global military expenditure has reached historic highs, just as the world is falling behind on its core development promises. We are building weapons when we should be building social infrastructure that advance the lives of our people. We are fighting wars that cause death and destruction when we should be fighting poverty and development.
President Ramaphosa still speaking there at the UN General Assembly, and he's saying quite a lot. We're going to take you back there as soon as we reconnect with him. The speech that he's making, very bold pronouncements that he's made, speaking out against what he says is the weaponization of a trade policy, and he's called out how this unilateral trade policy and economic cohesion are very dangerous. Let's take you back to President Cyril Ramaphosa.
It's being willfully undermined. There is an increasing reliance on unilateral military action in contravention of international law. The United Nations Security Council has proven to be ineffective in its current form and composition in carrying out its charter mandate to maintain international peace and security. South Africa remains deeply concerned by the erosion of the credibility of the Security Council and its failures to ensure accountability and uphold international law. As the security and humanitarian situations in the Democratic Republic of the Congo, Sudan, Gaza, and elsewhere deteriorate, it is a matter of great concern that there are countries that continue to violate international law and also defy the United States.
All right, that's President Cyril Ramaphosa there underscoring what he says is the UN's inability to carry out its mandate, particularly the UN Security Council.
Promoting accountability not accept that member have pledged to uphold the UN Charter. We have the ultimate responsibility to ensure and protect the rights that South Africa brought before the International Court of Justice. There is growing global consensus. There is growing global consensus that Israel is committing genocide in Gaza. Just last week, the United Nations Independent International Commission of Inquiry found that Israel is responsible for the commission of genocide in Gaza. As Palestinians continue to face genocide and famine, we have a duty to act. South Africa has acted in the interest of saving lives by insisting that the International Court of Justice should make a ruling that indeed genocide is being committed in Gaza and that it should stop. And we stand here to say it must stop. We welcome the historic high-level meeting held yesterday on the two-state solution yesterday in this very chamber. This reflects the determination of the global majority, a global majority that now stands at 142 and more countries, that Palestinians deserve a peaceful state alongside a peaceful Israel. Many nations in the world are calling for that, and that is the voice that we believe that Israel should heed, and those powerful nations that can make a two-state solution viable and possible and implementable should act in that regard. The long overdue announcement by increasing number of countries to recognize the state of Palestine is testament to this determination. We have a responsibility as the member states of the United Nations to reaffirm the right also of self-determination of the people of Western Sahara. The very first resolution of the United Nations General Assembly in January of 1946 called for the elimination of atomic weapons. The resolution was passed shortly after the catastrophic use of atomic bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki that killed thousands of people. Decades later, we have not made significant progress in the fulfillment of the commitment to nuclear disarmament. In 2026, next year, South Africa will be presiding over the first review conference of the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons. This treaty reaffirms that there is no greater assurance of non-proliferation than the complete prohibition of nuclear weapons. I was glad to hear that a number of leaders stood here to speak against nuclear weapons and the use thereof. This year we celebrate the 30th anniversary of the Beijing Declaration and Platform for Action as a roadmap for the achievement of gender equality, the empowerment of the women and girls of the world. South Africa reaffirms its unwavering commitment to the empowerment of women and their full, equal, and meaningful participation in all spheres of life. Yes, we would support also the election of a female Secretary General of the United Nations. The Beijing conference milestone reminds us of our shared responsibility to advance human rights, dignity, and justice for all. We are all equal, men and women, and there is no reason that we continue to hold the women of the world backwards. The right to development must be central to the policies and operational activities of the United Nations and its specialized agencies, programs, as well as funds. It must be at the core of the policies and strategies of the international financial and multilateral trading systems. As we celebrate 80 years of the United Nations, we must seize the opportunity to build a better United Nations for the next 80 years. What is needed now is a stronger and more capable United Nations, a United Nations that is based on the renewed commitment to its founding principles. We must invigorate the negotiations on the Security Council reform at the intergovernmental negotiations in the General Assembly, including by initiating text-based negotiations. The Security Council must be accountable. It must also be representative. It must be democratic and effective in executing its mandate. We can no longer accept that a large portion of the world's population is not represented in the United Nations Security Council. My own continent, Africa, home to 1.4 billion people, as well as South America, are not represented in the United Nations Security Council. This is unjust, this is unacceptable, and it must end. We want representation in the Security Council. We look forward to working with the Secretary General on the UN 80 initiative to ensure that our organization works more effectively and efficiently. Mandates given by member states must be implemented, and the necessary structural changes and program realignment must be implemented across the UN system. In the face of the decrease in funding to the United Nations to fulfill its mandate, the UN 80 initiative is important to maintain the integrity of the multilateral system and to uphold international law. Lastly, I am reminded that our collective membership of the United Nations is our shared humanity in action. The United Nations at 80 compels us to reflect on our collective achievements and to chart a way forward, building an organization that is able to address our common challenges. We must rise to the occasion and do our utmost together to ensure the political, economic, and social freedom of all humanity. We must reaffirm that freedom is indivisible and that the denial of the rights of one person diminishes the freedom of all of us. We must reaffirm the equal dignity and worth of every person and must therefore leave no one behind and no country behind. I thank you.
And that is how South Africa's President Cyril Ramaphosa ends his presentation to the UN General Assembly debate that is underway in New York. And we go back now to international relations analyst Dr. Charles Sinkala, who's been listening in to us to that address to share his thoughts. Dr. Sinkala, I'd like to get your impressions. If we were saying that US President Donald Trump held no punches when he was addressing the UN General Assembly earlier on. How would you characterize how President Cyril Ramaphosa of South Africa handled his presentation?
I feel sad, that President Cyril Ramaphosa can, go to an extent, to plead to the world that there's nothing more meaningful than the United Nations founding charter in terms of preserving the humanity and handing down the arms and the escalation of war across the world. The latter, presentation of Donald Trump's presentation at the United Nations General Assembly has been, idolized in terms of respecting only one unilateral nation, forgetting the 80 years of the accumulation and the repeated, response in terms of addressing the United Nations, main purpose in terms of this world. I think the world must heed, to the consist.
Are you still with us, Dr. Sinkala? All right, we're going to see if we can reconnect with Dr. Sinkala. Well, I'll just go over some of what President Cyril Ramaphosa was saying, and he really had a lot to say. He spoke about, as we mentioned, unilateral military action, really pointing a finger, calling out the UN Security Council for being ineffective in its mandate, particularly when it comes to peace, security, and international law keeping that. And he also addressed the fact that member states must respect commitments that they made in terms of common and differentiated responsibility. Here he was speaking about climate change, reiterating the fact that the global south, particularly Africa, bears the brunt of the effects of climate change, saying how it's obviously led to destruction of infrastructure, diminished livelihoods, and he really said that global leaders must start paying attention to this and holding themselves accountable. He spoke about inclusive economy, saying that South Africa, as a G20 leader, has come up with a committee on global wealth inequality that's going to be chaired by Professor Stiglitz. And he was saying that it will deliver its first ever report to G20 leaders about the state of inequality across the world. He spoke about the need for a global solidarity, fairer lending rules, particularly for the global south, saying that a lot of African countries spend a lot of their income on just paying off debt, and they are unable to support their commitments made to their various countries. So let's go back to international relations expert Dr. Charles Sinkala, who's going to speak to us through some of what he heard. So, Dr. Sinkala, I was speaking on just some of what President Cyril Ramaphosa said, and he spoke about economic cohesion. Now, this is the one thing that I want to talk about, because he spoke about how trade is being weaponized against countries, and of course South Africa would know about that. We spoke about it, you and I, earlier on, and he spoke about unprecedented unilateral trade policy. Your interpretation of what President Cyril Ramaphosa is trying to effect with these speech, very strong words that he's using. Is he trying to garner more support? Is he trying to say that countries need to allow each other to have freedom, to have the strategic multilateral alignments that they have?
Yes, indeed, Sapito. I think what is significant to note from President Ramaphosa's speech is that the United Nations has significantly failed to project what it, to present its founding mention for the past 80 years. We've seen wars in the Democratic Republic of Congo. We've seen the escalation of military in the Palestine and Israel conflict and many others in the world. That countries such as the United States of America, who's supposed to be in the forefront in terms of establishing a mechanism to de-escalate military support within these nations, has continuously, supported, the vying of policies of the United Nations. I think he has come out very strongly, and I think, as I mentioned, when we got disconnected, that President Cyril Ramaphosa and the whole entire, South Africa and the international policy will go down in history. That it's the only country that I'm aware of, in the African continent, if not in the world, that has boldly, spoken against, the United Nations Security Council, which has purportedly, purposely, brought up, a narrative that, they maintain peace and security. Meanwhile, the opposite has been done. And I think the message was very clear. And as well, the former president of Zimbabwe, Robert Gabriel Mugabe, also he mentioned that Africa cannot speak, on the position that, Africa is excluded, from the, the point of interaction of the United Nations Security Council, where matters has been left escalated and weaponizing, geopolitics and making unilateral, policies in the world, which has done nothing but exacerbating, the dehumanizing and the violation of human rights across the world.
Just a final question, and I'm going to juxtapose these 2 points that President Cyril Ramaphosa made, saying that the UN report found an unprecedented rise in expenditure on military exercises. But then he also used South Africa's presidency of the G20 to point out that there will be the first ever report on global inequality delivered to G20 leaders because of this committee chaired by Professor Joseph Stiglitz that they have appointed. What was your reading into this of where South Africa stands as a leader in the world and what is happening against the backdrop?
Well, South Africa seems to be consistent, in terms of its founding and the background, especially coming from the background of apartheid, and segregation and violation of human rights. And I think South Africa stands in history, to remain consistent in terms of human violations in South Africa, it's human violations in the United States of America, it's human violations in Italy, it's human violations in Zimbabwe, Zambia, and any other parts of the world. Unlike other nations, which has changed their policies depending on the allies that they are affiliated to, I think the world should now start thinking in terms of making policies that are multilaterally or bilaterally, dependent or affects other nations. Okay. I hope that this United Nations Security Council will revise its policies because, like I mentioned Tsepiso earlier, that the United Nations in itself has failed, to preserve and to protect citizens of this world in terms of its founding up.
All right, Dr. Sinkala, I'm afraid we're going to have to end it there, Dr. Charles Sinkala. And of course, President Cyril Ramaphosa ending with that call for reform, saying that Africa, which has 1.8 billion people, and South America are not represented at the UN Security Council. And that brings us to 2 minutes to 10. Well, just about getting there. And we find out now from Sheila Ntukumelo what to expect from African Diaries this evening.
I'm rather stunned by that stat. 1.8 billion of the world's population
1.4 billion
is in the continent.
Yes.
Interesting. Listen, before I digress and start talking about other things, we're talking all things GBV as part of the SABC campaign to spread awareness. And we're going to be looking at how finances frustrate the situation, right? More often than not, we think of women's dependency on men and them staying in abusive relationships. We're going to be challenging the identity of the breadwinner, because I don't think it's just a man problem. I think breadwinners who have to sort of have this push and pull experience with the economy, with perhaps pay cuts and all kinds of other frustrating things with respect to their economy, and then needing to provide and still keep that gentle approach to a relationship, to raising a child, that can be difficult as well. And so we tackle that facet of GBV and, of course, this campaign today.
All right, thank you very much, Sheila Ntukumelo with African Diaries coming up this evening from us, Africa World Hour. That's it. Do enjoy the rest of your viewing and listening here on Channel Africa.
1 hour, one continent, one voice. Africa World Hour with Tshepiso Makwetla on Channel Africa, the African perspective.
Chers auditeurs, Channel Africa aimerait mieux te connaître. Nous lançons un sondage sur l'audience et nous t'invitons à donner ton avis sur nos programmes. Participez à notre enquête sur www.channelafrica.co.